So I'm really capable of doing this. It actually draws attention. So just talk small. Just talk about it. Just talk small. Okay? Are we?
This more intriguing turns that you did, or that happened to you when you were CEO of PC 560 and the USS Blair. Things like that. It really
Not open. I turn sideways.
We're going to bring in just a few more chairs and then we will have to close the doors. A few housekeeping notes. Please turn your cell phones off. Remind you that there will be, once we start recording, we will not allow exit or entry. Following the recording, we'll go up to the third floor, which you can access by the stairway or the elevator. We'll serve a buffet lunch and have a short presentation.
Just waiting for a couple more chairs.
There are two chairs here and there's one over there. If you're a younger person and you're better on your feet than some, please
Don't take it.
defer to our elders. Welcome to the National World War II Museum and Laborde Family Day. I'm Trish Eubanks, Director of Corporate and Leadership Gifts. We're here today to honor 4 Laborde family members who participated in World War II, Alden, John, Lucian, and Bernadine. This is going to be part of our archive in the Center for the Study of the American Spirit. This is an unusual recording for us because we don't have the opportunity to have 4 brothers and a sister who was on the home front together speaking about their experiences during that transformational time. I want to thank Susan Couvion for putting this together. It really is what this museum is all about. We're about passing the lessons of World War II, the lessons learned, on to future generations. And we are grateful to you, sirs and madam, for participating. And now I'll introduce Seth Paradin, who's the head of our Research Services Department, and he'll conduct the panel.
How y'all doing? I'm not going to talk too much because y'all don't want to hear me talk. You want to hear them talk. But I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of the family members. Most of you guys probably already know, but I don't know if you know everything about these fellows. The first one on our panel here is Mr. Alden Laborde. He was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy from 1941 to 1945. And in 1938, class of 1938 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He entered the academy in 1934 and graduated number 55 in a class of 420, like I said, in 1938. Was commissioned an ensign and was released after 2 years of service because of less than perfect eyesight. Disappointed but philosophical, he returned home and started a business in Lafayette where he met his future wife, Margaret. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and Alden was sitting at the dinner table with his wife when someone called to tell him that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. He was quickly returned to duty, active duty, by the Navy and asked to report to Subchaser Training Center in Miami, Florida. After some training, he was given command of the USS PC 560. The PC 560 was stationed right here in New Orleans. And he served on 560 until early 1943 and returned to Miami to help train reserve officers. He married Margaret before being assigned as commanding officer of the USS Blair DE-147 destroyer escorting convoys in the North Atlantic for about 2 years. After a stint aboard the USS Kleinsmith in the Pacific, he was released from active duty Christmas Eve of 1945. Mr. Laborde believes his service in 2 theaters, Atlantic and the Pacific, was his real contribution to the war. Next to him is Mr. John Laborde. John started at LSU at the age of 16, is that right? In 1940?
That's right.
At that time, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, was mandatory for freshmen and sophomores. He was drafted in early 1943 and sent to OCS, Officer Candidate School in Fort Benning, Georgia. He was deployed to the Pacific as an infantry replacement and assigned to the 24th Infantry Division, landed in New Guinea and sent to Leyte in the Philippines. While there, John was interviewed to become part of MacArthur's Advanced Headquarters Adjutant staff. He was selected from a group of 200. John said, "I'm an infantryman, not an adjutant." Only combat action he saw was this, and he'll tell us more about it later on, but he was asked to lead a volunteer platoon on Leyte late in 1944 to capture Japanese field artillery embedded in the side of a mountain. Mission accomplished, and we'll get him to tell more about it as we go on. He next landed in Yokohama on August 29, 1945, 2 days before the surrender aboard the USS Missouri by the Japanese. Yokohama was an industrial city which had been firebombed. This is where MacArthur planned the surrender proceedings on September 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. At this time, John was a first lieutenant and then became a captain. He spent 1 year in Tokyo with MacArthur's general headquarters. John said MacArthur handled the transition brilliantly and came to be highly regarded by the Japanese. John came home on August 21st, 1946, and it was quite a culture shock to him. And again, we'll get him to tell us a little bit about that too, from coming from a combat theater into the United States as a civilian. Next to John is Lucien Laborde. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army in 1945. He served in the 29th Infantry Division, the 115th Infantry Regiment. He enrolled at LSU at an extremely early age, at the age of 15, and received his degree in agriculture. Started on an advanced degree in economics and landed a job surveying for a series of dams on the White River in Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. He was commissioned a second lieutenant at LSU through the ROTC, ordered to active duty, sent to Fort McClellan and the Army Intelligence School, Camp Ritchie, Maryland. He was eventually deployed to the ETO, the European Theater of Operations, in February 1943, and a convoy of 80 ships. Only 16 of the 80 ships made it to England, and it took him 27 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean. He landed as a captain and regimental adjutant in the second wave of D-Day on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy, between the 1st Division sector at Easy Red and the U.S. Army Rangers. His boat, LST-408, got caught on an underwater obstacle 50 yards offshore, and he had to wade to shore. Lucien's 115th Infantry Regiment lost all 3 battalion commanders and the regimental commander. He had to assume command of the 116th Infantry, which was a change of plan. Their immediate goal was to reach St. Lo, which took 6 weeks. It was assigned, the 29th was then assigned to take rest, some of the worst fighting that the 29th had endured throughout the entire war. And later on, he served in the Battle of the Bulge. He wrote the Presidential Unit Citation for the 115th Infantry Regiment, remained in Germany after the war, got out of the Army as a Lieutenant Colonel, Director of G3 Operations, returned to the United States on December 31st, 1945, and was discharged on April 1st, 1946. And last but certainly not least is Mrs. Cliff Laborde Jr., or Birdie as we call her. Her husband Cliff, the last brother, was refused Army service due to medical conditions, and he is now deceased, unfortunately. He stayed home and fought the war at the home front. And Miss Bernadine is going to tell us about what life was like on the home front, while the other 3 brothers were serving in the Army and the Navy. We're going to start off with you, Doc. Tell us a little bit about how you came to join, how you got to Annapolis, how you came into the Naval Academy, and a little bit of your time in the Navy.
Thank you. When you have free lunch, you can get a lot on board, as you can see. I was at LSU.
Our party's the night before.
I went to LSU for a year. Lucien was already coming along. My older brother was there. My father, a school teacher, was even LSU's $100 a year tuition was beginning to be a problem for us. I talked to the folks at LSU, the ROTC people. There was a General Colonel Middleton who was in charge, and he later was a hero in World War II, incidentally, as a general in Europe. But he advised me to try for West Point. I went to you had to get an appointment from a congressman in those days. Spoke to a senator. He said he didn't have anything at West Point, but he had an appointment at Annapolis for the next year. That was just as good. I said, okay, I'll take it. So that was my Navy career decision. I went on to the Naval Academy. This was in the middle of the Depression in 1934. The Navy had been cut way back. Reminds me of the present time when got all these peace guys saying we need to cut back on the Army, we need to surrender, we need to pull out of Iraq. That was going on then. They had scrapped most of the Navy vessels under some post-World War I treaties. They had cut the staff back at the Naval Academy, and incidentally, the cash allowance for plebes, that was a freshman at the Naval Academy, in those days was $2 a month, and they cut it to $1.75, which was part of that percentage reduction in the Navy budgets. That gave Japan and Germany free hand to go ahead and start building up and planning for the future. The Japanese were building battleships, and so were the Germans, and we were trying to convince them that if we didn't have a Navy, everything would be fine. I think we could take the same lessons now. Some of these, mostly Democrats in Washington, are still talking about the same way. Be nice to them and leave them alone. Or we can't beat them, don't worry. We can't beat them, so let's give in. And that's just not the way it should be, in my opinion. We'll pay a price for that one of these days. We can beat them if we decide to get after it and do it, as we always have.
Tell us, you were discharged from the Navy in '41 because of your eyesight. What happened? How did that all go down, and how did you eventually get back into the Navy?
In those days, they were looking for reasons for the reasons I have just said, the budget and cutting back on the military. They were looking for ways to get rid of us. They didn't really have spots for everybody who graduated from the Naval Academy. You had to have 20/20 uncorrected eyesight for a permanent commission. You got a commission when I got out, what they called a temporary commission, or a probationary commission. Then in 2 years you had to go back for a medical exam. And that got you to 1940, when the war clouds were getting pretty heavy out there, but the Navy medical system was still on the old Depression rules, and if you weren't 20/20 uncorrected, out you went. So that's when I came home and looked around for a job and so forth.
And you were called, when were you called back to active duty? Right after Pearl Harbor?
Right after Pearl Harbor in December of 41. Sorry.
41.
And I stayed in the Navy, right on through it, on sea duty most of the time, with the Navy was involved. These Army brothers of mine, they had big deals going, like Lucien thinks D-Day won the war, and John thinks MacArthur won the war single-handedly. The Navy was out there every day. Out in the Pacific, they were having a D-Day nearly every 2 or 3 weeks.
When they weren't in port.
I thought we lost the Navy. There were no ports. There were no ports out in the Pacific. I tell you, we never got ashore.
You were just there a few days.
Anyway, they had a lot more experiences in 2 or 3 months than I did in combat for 4 years.
It's not always a bad thing, but tell us a little bit about some of the more intriguing experiences that happened to you while you were CO at
The main memories you have of North Atlantic Convoy, which was my main job in when I was skipper of the Blair, was more the monotony and the weather. Unlike Lucien's convoy, he wasn't lucky enough to be under our group out of, I guess, 25 round trips across the North Atlantic, we never lost a ship. We had several little scares. We dropped a lot of depth charges on what might have been whales or wrecks or no telling what. Every now and then we'd bring up some oil, but never had a confirmed kill. But the monotony of it and the weather, sometimes you'd go a week or two just hanging on. Relatively small ship, a DE is 360 feet long, which sounds pretty good size, but you get out in the Atlantic with 30 or 40 foot waves going for 3 or 4 days. Sometimes the morning after a night when the sun would come out and we could get a navigational fix. In those days we didn't have all the celestial, satellite navigation and what have you. We had to rely on celestial, which was star sites and sun sites. We'd get a reading that was behind where we were 2 or 3 days before. These convoys were old Liberty ships that could do 6 or 8 knots at best. And it'd take us 6 weeks to get across the North Atlantic. And you had to go with the speed of the slowest one and trying to keep them closed up, which was always difficult. And we were about 10 ships in the screening them with sonar gear to try to find any submarines, but we just were lucky enough not to ever have a major attack. We'd hear about them. They had these German wolf packs in there. And of course, in the early days before this got started, the Germans had a real turkey shoot along the east coast there. We didn't have any escort vessels, didn't have any anti-submarine business. And when they declared war, these submarines of Hitler just fanned out from France mostly and moved to the east coast and were just knocking these ships off. When I was in Miami at the school, we'd go out and pick up survivors from ships that were getting sunk there. Then I went out to the Pacific to finish the story. I was skipper of the Klein-Smith, which was, I had an underwater demolition unit on board that was a so-called frogmen. And while we were en route to Okinawa, between Weehawken and Okinawa, we heard about the atomic bomb. And that was a great day in our lives because our assignment was a pretty sacrificial one where we were going to go in ahead of the landings in Japan to clear with this underwater unit and clear the beaches and try to draw out the fire and see where the guns were in Kyushu and southern Japan ahead of a bunch of Marines who were going to go in there. And so we didn't cry at all when we heard about the atomic bomb.
When did you come back home?
Came back home at the end of 1945. The peace was signed in August, and they issued orders to all ships to send home just as many people as you could. There was a point system depending how long they were there, so we were stripped down to almost no one who had any experience at all, except me. I had nobody could even stand a bridge watch. So I had to stay up there, and they put me in, I thought I'd get to come home, but they sent the frogmen home and put me in charge of a bunch of minesweepers. And then we went minesweeping up in the China Sea and the Sea of Japan and Straits of Hokkaido up in North Japan. And until I got a relief around Christmas time, I had to stay on board. But it was just a bunch of fresh-caught firemen and rookies, and hardly anybody on board knew what was going on. But they did, I think in my opinion, a marvelous job of disbanding the services after the war. When my relief finally came, I went ashore in Okinawa and bummed a ride back on a transport that was bringing troops home. And the skipper told me, he says, I have no qualified officers. If you can stand a watch, you and I can do watch and watch all the way home. That means 4 hours on and 4 hours off on the bridge. I said, I'll do that. We'll go all the way, and that's how I bummed a ride home to San Diego and then took the train here, got discharged. I think it was about Christmas Eve.
Well, John, if you would, tell us how you came to be on General MacArthur's staff, if you will.
The hard way. Since you mentioned, I started LSU in 1940 and had been there in ROTC. In those days, ROTC was mandatory for the first 2 years of all male students. So I'd been there for 2 years, and toward the end of 1942, the government drafted all of us and left us in college. And in early 43, I had been made cadet colonel of the infantry regiment at LSU. We were called into active duty and sent to different officer candidate schools, depending on what we had been in college. Our group, some 200 of us, went to the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. We were the first 4-month class. You used to hear reference to 90-day wonders. Well, we were not 90-day wonders. We had been in the classes for about 3 days when they changed and said, you're going to be the first 120 days. So we did that and finally graduated from officer candidate school. And I guess because I finished in the top of my class, I was retained at the infantry school, excuse me, to train and grade 2 more officer candidate classes that were coming through from various colleges. When that was done, you asked me how did I happen to become an adjutant? On August the 15th of 1945, after the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, we got a message through Switzerland that the Japanese were willing to consider unconditional surrender. They sent, John MacArthur directed that they send a plane from Tokyo, unmarked plane, to Manila with their negotiating group. They did. They came in on the 16th, 15th or 16th of August. And our headquarters group dictated to them the terms of the surrender. They agreed to those and left, went back to Tokyo, and from then on, I think that's what Alden is talking about. That wasn't the surrender. That was the first news we had that was publicized to the public, that Japan was willing to surrender without any negotiations, unconditionally. As you can imagine, a lot of things took place in the next 2 weeks. But to make a long story short, we, the advanced echelon, went up to Yokohama aboard ship, arriving there on August the 29th, 1945. Keep in mind that the surrender was signed aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. So we were there at least 2 to 3 days in advance and set up the advanced headquarters in the customs house in Tokyo Bay at Yokohama. The general officers flew in, we went in by ship and did the work. One of the interesting things was there was a real controversy between MacArthur and President Truman as to the proper time for the signing of the surrender. Truman wanted it done during the daylight hours in the United States. MacArthur wanted it done during daylight, comfortable hours in Japan. Guess who won? MacArthur and his group signed at 11 a.m. aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay in Yokohama. From there we went to Tokyo after 2 or 3 weeks, no, 2 weeks in Yokohama, where the Japanese were charged with feeding us, the whole group. So after having beer and fish for breakfast for about 4 or 5 days, we decided that that should be cut short. And so the headquarters was moved into various office buildings in downtown Tokyo, principally the Daiichi building, which is right across the street from the Imperial Palace. And that's where it is today. Same building, same there. But the rest of us stayed in makeshift office buildings and places like that until better arrangements could be made. Those were interesting times to the general public because, and to us too, because no one had any idea what kind of receptivity we would have when we arrived in Yokohama on the night of the 29th of August. Strangely enough, we had dictated that there should be a policeman on the corner of every block within a certain area around the Grand Hotel and where the Missouri was and where we were. And Dick Guthrie and I walked through after we arrived, and there was a terrible smell in the area. We later learned that it was rice cooking behind closed doors. There was not a sight of a Japanese except for the policemen on those corners, so they complied completely. The area between Yokohama and Tokyo is about a 20-mile stretch, which had been firebombed by the Air Force, and it was totally leveled. It made us realize that things had gone a lot better than our intelligence really knew. And I guess had we known some of that, the complete destruction of Japan at that point, there's a possibility that the war could have ended sooner. But the big question was invading Honshu and the home islands of Japan. MacArthur estimated that we would lose 750,000 troops. Washington had estimated we would lose 400,000 troops. Whichever number you pick, it was a tremendous, tremendous risk. And therefore, the atomic bombs made a lot of sense, and that got the attention of the Japanese. One of the things that, well, history shows that I stayed in Japan then in Tokyo for a year. While all of this unraveled, the Japanese people were very, very interested in the American way. The soldiers got along very, very well with the Japanese. And the year moved on. One of the interesting things was when we first arrived, the Japanese were nowhere to be found, even in Tokyo. But as MacArthur opened the headquarters and began moving in and out, Japanese would congregate around the front of the Daiichi building, starting with a few, just to watch him walk in and out. By the time I left a year later, there was some 5,000 that would gather about 3 or 4 times a day just to watch him walk in and out of the building. So he did a magnificent job. The coup was that he prevailed in convincing Washington that the emperor needed to be left alone and not prosecuted or done anything on war crimes. That really solved a lot of problems. The Japanese totally agreed with that. They put down their arms. There were none of this you hear in Iraq about, explosions and people fighting back and all. That just didn't happen. And we were very fortunate for that. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to generalize on is that as I think back over the theaters of war, 2 things. One, it's almost impossible for any of us here today, or anybody else, including the media, to verbalize the state of World War II and the country's reaction to it. After Pearl Harbor, the whole country committed to World War II and were willing to do the things that were necessary to build back and eventually win the war. I don't think we have that today. We certainly don't appear to, and I'm not sure how we ever get back there. The other thing I want to mention is that, you know, all theaters of war are pretty bad. But when you look back on the differences between the European theater and the Pacific theater, I have to tell you, it would be comparing apples and oranges. The European theater was generally known better in the 1940s by the American public. There was magnificent civilization. You had London, you had Rome, you had all of the places that everybody had heard of. You had castles in the countryside. Okay, Sylvia, I'm almost finished. You had country inns. You had I have my watch here. I'm still on schedule. You had country inns. You had people who took you in to their homes and all that. I've heard Lucian talk about that, the magnificent French families that took care of them and so forth. That was not the case in the Pacific. People had hardly heard of Hawaii and Alaska, and certainly had never heard of Tarawa and Bougainville and Guadalcanal and Guam and Taiwan and Tarawa and Midway and all of those places, Iwo Jima. Everything that had to go in those areas with the American forces had to be brought there. We brought our food, our water, our tents. There was no such thing. It was mostly jungle fighting and pretty horrible stuff. But there was not that civilization. It was a mysterious part of the world in the minds of most Americans. And you know, that was a great, great difference in the two theaters. It just happened that that was the way it was. No fault of anyone, but nevertheless, even Australia was so far away, and New Zealand, that we had never heard of Ulithi and Brisbane and places like that. So anyway, that gives you a kind of a thumbnail of where I was, what I did, and I'm back here. Got back in August, the end of August 1946, enrolled in LSU law school. CE had already registered me in law school, so within about a week I was at LSU fighting those crazy professors who were carried away with Planyall and the redactors. And so that was a little bit of a tough adjustment for some of us, but thank God most everybody made it. That's it.
Well, Mr. Lucian, leaves you kind of a hard follow-up there, but you were the 29th. Tell us, obviously the biggest thing that probably happened to you in your wartime was D-Day. Tell us about D-Day.
I first want to borrow John's watch because better borrow mine. That'll give me the rest of the day. Better use mine. I don't think it's working. When I look around and see what Susan has done in promoting this occasion, I think it's an amazing job. But I wonder, do you do funerals?
How you feeling?
I might want to keep that in mind. No, well, we've heard about the Pacific, and we've heard about the Atlantic, and part of the Pacific, the Navy's end of it. But the real war took place in Europe. Start at the beginning. I think he told you that I was commissioned at LSU. I had to wait 2 or 3 years after I graduated to be 21 in order to get my commission. But I'd gone to work for the federal government and was called from there shortly before Pearl Harbor. I was called active duty. I was sent to Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, to be physically examined, along with the gentleman many of you know, have known, Earl Edwards. They looked at Earl and said he had polyps.
and he couldn't go. And they didn't even look at me. They said, "You're in." I was sent to Fort McClellan, Alabama, which was a branch and material training center. And I stayed there from February until August. And as John says, I'd been promoted from a platoon leader to battalion adjutant, and then was sent to Army Intelligence School at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. It's now Camp David, I think. I stayed there for the complete course for 3 months, and then I was kept on as an instructor for 3 more months. At that time, we had invaded Africa. And on the landing, a large number of intelligence personnel were lost. So they contacted our school and asked for volunteers. Well, 20 of us volunteered to go. We thought we were going to Africa, but we were diverted to England because they had drawn, the 29th Division was in training in England, and they had drawn the intelligence personnel from there. So we thought we'd replace them, but they had already replaced them from within. So I was again a platoon leader, and stayed there for a while in training in Cornwall. First in Salisbury on the Salisbury Plains. Then we marched to Cornwall, 150 miles, and trained there for the rest of the training period, 13, 14 months. I was shortly after that brought up to battalion adjutant, as John was, and then regimental adjutant. And that's my capacity as a captain when I landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. In the training process, we had made many fake invasions, always turning back to England, though, after a while. On one time, one of our group ran into a bunch of German E-boats, and we lost 600 people on a training mission. That didn't come out until well after the war. But anyhow, a lot of things didn't come out until after the war. We shipped from Plymouth, England, loaded up there. 29th Division was one of the lead divisions, the 29th and the 1st, for the invasion of Normandy. We didn't know where we were going, and most of us didn't. I knew because of a certain position that I held. General Eisenhower was our MacArthur. He addressed all of the troops before the invasion in a very meaningful manner. I think his talk has been memorialized and was great. Everybody that loaded up for the invasion had to first sign a statement as to whether they wanted to be buried in Europe or sent back to the States. That was just SOP. We moved in, we thought we were going to move in on the 5th, but there was a terrific storm in the English Channel, and we were held over, hopefully for a break. And General Eisenhower's weatherman said that we would have about a 12-hour break at a certain time on the 6th. And he made the decision to go. So everybody moved across. I crossed the channel in a boat number 408 that held 212 people. And it was a rough channel crossing. Most everybody except me was nauseated. I held up fine. And the first wave went in at 7 o'clock. It's the 116th Regiment of our division. And we would follow them. They had certain things they were supposed to do and capture, and then we had certain things to do on the follow-up. Well, most of the 116th stayed on the beach. So when we landed, we had to forget our objectives. We had to take over the job that the one at 16th had been assigned to do. And that worked pretty well. The Americans could do that. The Germans couldn't do that. They were so highly trained that if things went wrong, they didn't know what to do. But the Americans just figured out, look, if I can't do this, what else got to do? We'll do it this way. And we went on and had a successful operation, moved in, I'd say within a mile and a half through the first night. The problem with the beach was that we had a 90-foot cliff at the back of the beach. And the beach was about 150 yards wide. And the Germans had had 3 years to build up concrete fortifications and emplacements to have machine gun and mortar fire and everything zeroed in to any point on the beach. And all up and down the hill, they had solid minefields. So it was a job to get up there. But fortunately, the 115th got to the top. That's a regiment of about 15,000 people. Got to the top of the cliff in pretty good shape and was able to reorganize into battalions and take on certain objectives. We went on. We knew that they were going to flood a large area in front of us by opening certain dams. We brought a bunch of jeeps that had been prepared for amphibious work, and those landed 2 days after we did. So when we went across that inundated area, we tried the jeeps, but there were canals through there that had high banks, and the jeeps could get through the water and get over the bank, but once down in the canal, they couldn't come up again. So it became a foot operation. We got through that okay, but it was slow fighting, tough going for day after day through the hedgerows. The hedgerows were built up over the centuries by farmers picking up rocks in their fields and putting them on the edges of the field. And that had grown up into trees that big and 6 feet high, 12 feet wide. And the Germans had used those things to have machine gun positions through them, and we had to go through the open field to take the next hedgerow. And that's what they call the bocage, the hedgerow fighting area. It was very costly in human life. One experience I had, excuse me, and some of you in here were able to share it with me 3 summers ago, when we went back to Normandy. I think there were 35 of us. Jean. At one point, we were held up to make the final attack on St. Lo, which was a hub, a center of communication that we needed and the Germans had to keep. So it was a terrific fight. We were waiting for General McNair to assemble 1,000 bombers to saturate the place with bombs just before we move in. So we were held up for 3 days in a certain area there. And at one point, one of the soldiers came up to me and said, "Don't you speak French?" I said, "A little." He said, "We've got a Frenchman under his house. He dug a hole in his house and he's in there. I don't know if we ought to shoot him or what." I said, "Well, I'll go talk to him." And his name was Pierre Lemonnier. Al Lemoine, probably one of your ancestors. He had sent his family away, and he thought the war was going to roll right past him, and he'd stay there and look after his chickens and his hogs and cows. So he had stocked this hole into the dining room with wine and cheese and bread, and we got along real well. anyhow, that went on, and we eventually took over St. Louis and beyond. That's when Patton broke through. Once we got St. Louis out of the way, Patton broke through. He had been assembling his army on the Cherbourg Peninsula, and he broke through with his tanks and went all the way to the German border. But he bypassed Brest and the Brittany Peninsula, and that was given to General Middleton again, who was a corps commander, as an assignment to clean out Brest so it could become a usable port for the Americans. Well, we were assigned to that corps at that time, and very easy movement up to about 15 miles from Brest. Then from there on, we had one of the hardest fights we've had in the whole war because of the fortifications they had prepared, all types of stuff, forts, concrete, whole buildings with 6-foot walls and so forth. To where eventually, when we got in closer, there was a series of positions all the way around Brest that we couldn't knock out. They looked like little concrete slabs, little curved concrete places. And they were covering the front perfectly with machine gun fire. And that's when I got my break. One of the assistant division commander came into our headquarters, and he was talking to our regimental commander, and he said, I've got some new photographs. Let's look these things over and see what we can figure out. We're stymied. And of course, I had specialized in aerial photo interpretation at Camp Ritchie. So I got to looking at those things, and it struck me that that had to be an underground arrangement. And that's why we couldn't knock them out. So I explained that to the general, and he bought the idea, organized a task force with British flamethrower tanks and infantry, and skirted the edge of the Brittany Peninsula up to the back entrance at the sub-pens. And that's when they finally surrendered. They had a 400-bed hospital on the ground. They had all of the naval headquarters for that part of the Navy that operated out of there. And all of these machine gun positions were operated by people 40 feet underground in periscopes. So finally, that fell, and General Middleton was very happy with that. So he assigned us to go to the German border. So we did, and we made a motor move through Paris to the Siegfried line. And it had been penetrated in one or two places. So we got into a little town called Geilenkirchen, which is a German town just past the French border. There we stayed for fighting toward the town of Jülich. Jülich was a fort town back in Charlemagne's day and was well fortified. We fought our way through there, through the open plains. That part of Germany was, every little community was tight. People around the church and the well, and all the houses in one little spot, and all of the land between that town and the next was open agricultural land. So it was just one little town after the other that had to be taken. And that's what we spent several months doing till we got to the Roer River. Meanwhile, the Germans had moved into the Battle of the Bulge, their final effort to try to divide the British and the American forces. They were going to try to penetrate to the town of Antwerp. All of the British forces were north of there, and all of the American forces were south of there. And if they could have separated us, divided us, lost control, they would have accomplished a major victory. Well, that's when it snowed, and you've heard a lot of reports of the Battle of the Bulge and McNulty's reply. His answer to a demand to surrender was nuts. And our job at that point was to hold the northern edge of the German penetration to prevent them from turning to Antwerp and to let them just extend into France as far as they had fuel to go, and then they'd have to stop. So that's about what happened. It was a very costly fight. Once we were victorious in the Battle of the Bulge, the end of the war was in sight. We crossed the Roer River first. My division spearheaded the final attack, and then went up through the town of Mönchengladbach, which was, when we took it, that was the largest German city to fall to the Americans at that time. Then we crossed the Rhine River and went through the industrial area of Germany and up to the Elbe. When we got to the Elbe River, we had to stop. The deal had been made that the Russians would be allowed to take Berlin. The Germans wanted us to move in and take Berlin. So thousands and thousands of Germans crossed the Elbe River on inner tubes, any kind of boat, anything to get them across, to surrender to the Americans rather than risk surrendering to the Russians. And I'm sure they had a good reason for doing that. Anyhow, that was about the final phase of that thing. Then the war ended, and on the 7th of May, regardless of what you read about the 8th of May or the 6th, it was the 7th of May. I was on duty in the war room, and all the division staff had to take turns in night duty in the war room. And this telegram, we called them TWXs, telegram came through. You remember the old telegrams that had little lines pasted on them? From Eisenhower's headquarters to the commanding general of the 29th Division, saying that the Germans had signed a peace treaty as of 30 minutes before that. General Gehart, I woke him up. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I woke him up and I said, read this. And he did, and he initialed it, and he said, get the information out to all of the commanders. So I did. I had copies made and sent out. But I kept the original, and I still have it.
You gotta give it to the museum.
Susan,
Okay.
my time is up. Anyhow,
You came home.
after the war, I came home. I stayed there, though, from the 7th of May until the 31st of December, because of the assignment my division was given to secure an area about the size of Vols Parish, because everything American had to go out through the port of Bremen or Bremerhaven, which this area included, and everything coming in from then on had to come through there. So that was my job as operations officer of the 29th, to secure that area. Our whole division was coming over by boat, coming home. So when they were about 50 miles out, the head of the yacht club or somebody gave us a boat and took us out 50 miles out, and we climbed up the rope ladders and we rode in with the troops, which you're supposed to do. One thing about that was that there was a very strict rule that you couldn't take any pets home. That was out. Everything was checked as they were loaded on their boats to make sure nobody took any pets home. Well, when we got up on that boat, it was just like a kennel. dogs all over the place. How they got there, I don't know. Anyhow, I was then sent to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where I was separated. Caught a ride to not Slidell, but right there to the Norco. Right there to Norco. And my daddy had borrowed some tires from somebody and drove up to there to meet me and took me home, and that was it.
That was a ship, not a boat, wasn't it, that you were on?
Still not a what?
You came back on a ship, not a boat.
Tidewater had boats.
Technicalities.
Well, Mrs. Laborde, if you would pleasure us with a couple of stories about how you stayed at home and fought the war with your husband in the United States here in Louisiana. What was the home front like during the war for you?
Well, my struggle was a little bit different from theirs. I was at home with
Get a
two.
little closer, Bernie.
My struggle was a little bit bigger than theirs, different from theirs, because I had 2 children under 4 that I was taking care of. And Lucian said that he was working in Arkansas, wasn't he? And then he quit his job to come to wait to be called, to be drafted. So he stayed with us for a couple of months, I guess. So that way, my children became very close to him, and I became very close to him too, because I knew him better than the other 2 boys. So I corresponded with him during the war, and that was with V-mail. Do you know what V-mail is? The mail, the regular letters could not go through. They were too large. So they were condensed into little thing about 3 inches wide and 3 inches long and 1.5 inches wide, I guess. I'm guessing.
May I comment? They were placed on film, and a whole roll of film was flown over. Then they were reprinted once they got to the United States and delivered.
But they were also very censored. A lot of times you get mail with black across the words because they were saying things that they maybe should not have. You see, we had no television then. We depended on radio and the newspaper. But news was really, it's so, I'm sorry, I have trouble with words, I guess my mind, but anyway. Everything was censored. The newspaper, the radio, everything was censored. So you really didn't get much information except that you knew he was doing okay, he was well. But that was the way we corresponded with, at the time. I lived in a small town, and there were army camps not far from us. So a lot of the soldiers would come into Marksville for recreation. They also came through Marksville on armed maneuvers, and they went right in front of our house, and Ted and me would run out and say, hey, 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 to the soldiers. You know, the people of Marksville were very considerate and kind to the soldiers. When they came into town, you know, went into the different stores or restaurants, so many of the citizens would invite them into their homes for a home-cooked meal. And that was generally done by a lot of them. In fact, a lot of them married the local girls and then introduced new names like Deco and with different names into the town. At that time, though, the manufacturers had to quit making what they were making and make war goods. Like the vacuum cleaner people quit making vacuum cleaners and made whatever the only weapons that they needed. And so things were rationed. Everything was rationed, whether it was your gas or your tires or whatever. Gasoline, also your sugar, flour, cooking oil, meats, and many other things were rationed. So you were issued little ration books with little stamps that will allow you to get just so much for that. We had no hardship, though, in Markville. You know, you live in a small town, you have a lot of advantages over a city. we had a local butcher who got his own meat, so we had all the meat we needed, you know. And what else? I'm not sure that I can add anything else, except that my husband was crippled and could not join the Army, and he was very disheartened about that. And of course, he loved his brothers so much and hated to see them leave. But then when they returned, he tried to help them get back into civilian life in any way that he could. And we were all happy to have him back. And I have to say, I think it was absolutely remarkable that these three brothers went to war and really were right in the middle of the war. They were not spared at all. And yet they all returned and living to an old age. So really, I think that we should applaud them.
Thank you.
We're gonna, we'll take just a couple, we're running a little over, but we'll take a couple questions. If any of you guys have any questions for the four sitting up here, speak loudly, sir.
Uncle Johnny, you were gonna talk about what happened in camping on the grounds of the Hotel Manila, and I don't think you may have gotten back to it.
Well, that related to my comment later about the fact that there was really nothing in the Pacific that we found that we could latch on to. Lucia's talking about, St. Lo and the countrysides that they went through and so forth, meeting families. Alden was getting leaves in New York and London and all when they'd hit the ports. In the Army, in the Pacific, as I said, everything that supported the troops in the Pacific had to be carried there from
the Navy.
From the United States. Yeah, that's true. They needed to do something. But it was Kent. It was part of that thought that I was bringing up, that even in a place like Manila, which you'd normally think of with stars in your eyes, when we arrived, it was a hellhole. The stench was so horrible there from decaying bodies of Japanese that you could hardly stay there. One of the interesting things about Manila was that the Australian troops always had access to ice for some reason. Ice was a commodity that everybody would kill for in the Pacific. But some way, somehow, the Australians had the key to the lock, and they could always get ice. So everybody catered to the Australian troops to get a little touch of ice toward the close of the day. So you see how simple life was.
Okay, we got time for just a couple, ma'am.
Were you ever able to correspond with each other during that period?
Yes.
Yeah, but mostly
Alden
through
and I did.
through Mom and Dad.
Alden and I actually met on a prearranged date in New York City prearranged 3 months ahead of time, and we both showed up at the same time. Commodore Hotel.
Now, Alden, when he made his way into the Pacific, sent me a message. This is after the war. I was in Tokyo, and I got a message that the Kleinsmith was in the port of Nagoya, and that,
What was left of it?
huh?
What was left of it? Nagoya was flat. That's where the Mitsubishi was building these airplanes.
At any rate, by the time I got a message back to him, his ship had already left, so we never could
Well,
get.
that's why I looked for Lucien. I was in Cherbourg after the invasion and spent a day on the beach trying to find out where in the world they were, but nobody seemed to know among the Army people that I contacted.
That's
there.
typical of the Army.
Well,
And I was in the,
we were
I was
highly
in,
appreciative of the Navy at that time because the Germans had a whole bunch of E-boats at Cherbourg. And they were very fast-moving, very deadly little boats that could clean out a convoy.
they were torpedo boats.
Torpedo boats. And Alden's boat and a lot more naval ships had the job of screening off and holding them away from the invasion fleet. And we were very happy. We didn't know that till after the war.
I also looked for you in Plymouth when you were loaded out. I was there with a convoy, but it was pandemonium. They were just all loading on boats and trucks running around, and there was no way to find you.
Uncle Lucian, of the 212 who were on your landing boat at Normandy, do you know how many survived?
In my boat,
Of the 212?
we had very few casualties on the beach because we had a ravine. If any of you have been back to Normandy and been to the American Cemetery, and if you walk toward the channel, there's a little ravine running down from the beach to the top of the hill. And most of our regiment went through there. And we had a few casualties from mines to start with, but after that it's pretty good going. And we had very few. Our casualties came after that. You heard him say that we lost our three battalion commanders and the regimental commander. That was in the first 2 days. So the fight was for us was after that. The 116th had the beach fight.
Man,
Bernie didn't elaborate a whole lot, and I just wanted Dad to maybe tell a little bit about how we know how Dee had everybody situated and had his mind made up what they were gonna do when they came back home and who they were gonna marry and everything else. But I would like you to tell, because I think it's so interesting, you're talking about Pierre Lemonnier, how you took Bird and C.E. back, and how you actually, the four of you actually got to see Pierre Lemonnier so many years later, and then how when we went back, his grandchildren found you so many years later.
That's a long story.
No, but it make it short because but tell how you did say, C.E. did get to see everything and it's all the same, and we did too, but
You mean when they returned?
when y'all went, when the four of you went.
When you and I and Peg and C.E.
I'll
went-
try to answer that as best I can. He got me a job with a seismic crew as a helper, dragging cables through the swamps and all that. But it was hard to find a job then. He took John on as a law partner and got him going. And he got Lucien a job on a farm, and I think
Found him a wife.
found him a wife. When it came,
I did that myself.
that all came with the deal, I think. Just very quickly,
See,
he saw to it that we all found a job and got something to do.
I'd asked C.E. to look for a farm for us to buy when I got back. And he found one called Rosewood, owned by Godcho Sugars. 4,440 acres of land. He represented Mr. Nolan, Peggy's father, as his lawyer. And he had talked to him about it. And they decided, they talked to Mr. Byram, who had a
Here's a
oil mill,
Yeah.
that they would all get together and have the thing appraised and see if they could buy it, and I'd run it. I had $2,000 is all. See, he had offered to mortgage it. I don't know if you know that. He had offered to mortgage his home. This Mr. Nolan said he'd do whatever he did. Mr. Barber. We came up with $128,000. Mr. Nolan said he'd handle the transaction because he bird hunted with Mr. Godshow. They were good friends. So he made that offer. He got a telegram back from a few days later from Mr. Godshow saying, I have an offer for $144,000. If you will meet it, I'd much prefer for you to have it. Well, I won't say what Mr. Nolan said about his faith, but he said he's just trying to get a few extra dollars. A few days later, we heard that it actually sold to another man for $144,000. That was over 1,000 acres of sugarcane land, 600 head of registered Angus cattle, and about 3,400 acres of good timber. The bank had appraised it at $128,000. Today that would be what, 10 million? Anyhow,
Pierre Lemonnier.
y'all want some more of that?
Just the short version because it's so interesting.
Okay, this man I told you that I found under the home with the wine and the cheese and so forth. Okay, in 1973, that's 29 years after the war, C.E. was determined to get to Normandy and learn all about what we had done. He told Peg, he said, I'll give you and Peg first-class tickets by air if you will go with us, but we want to get a limousine and travel the whole route that you covered. So we did. The limousine, by the way, was only one of two in Paris. Had been turned in by Lady Bird Johnson, and Buddy Trimble of Merrill Lynch, was that? Mm-hmm. Merrill Lynch said he had a connection there and could get it for us. Well, anyhow, we had it for 6 days for $600. We traveled through an area where the fight was, and near where I met this man under his home. And I told the driver, I said, pull up to the crossroads here, a little place called Laborde, the blacksmith shop. And I got out and I knocked on the door of the home, and a young lady came out, and I told her who I was. And I said, does the name Pierre Lemonnier mean anything to you? She said, yes, he's Parotage. He's part of our family. I said, where is he? Well, he's been very, very sick with a heart condition. He's old, very old. He's been in Paris for 2 years in a hospital. But he came home last night. So she said, the third house over. So we went over. I knocked on the door. His wife, much younger than he was, came to the door, and I told her who I was. And I could look through there, and there was a long dining room table there, nothing on it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this old man sitting there with his suit on and his cap on, just sitting there. He said, he's totally deaf. So she wrote him a note, and who I was and whatnot. He read it, he looked at me and read it again. He stood up, hugged me, he said, "Mon capitaine." Well, about that time I needed a drink. Anyhow, 3 summers ago, I took 35 of us over there and had the bus, and we did the whole thing again, went everywhere that we had fought through Normandy. And we had contacted the man who married the daughter of Pierre Lemonnier, and he had arranged to have a meal in the community of Coutances where they lived. Well, when we got there, they had the biggest layout you ever saw. They had people from all around the area gathered there. That every kind of food that you can imagine, every kind of drink you could imagine, and the nicest people you ever saw. Just so happy to see all of us. I wanted to know, ask questions, wanted us to go look at that castle, this and that, just as pleasant as they could be. Well, we all enjoyed that very much. And I think all those who were on that trip enjoyed it.
Like I said, the difference between the European and nobody wanted to go to the Pacific. Does anybody want to go?
Now, wait, I have to say this, though. When in 1773,
I can tell you, I'm not going to lead you.
Well, that's
When-
all,
when
that's
we
all the
went
time
on
we
the,
have for questions or comments.
Hold on, Mom.
I'm sorry.
They sent the ones to Europe that could appreciate that culture. The rest had to go to the Pacific.
oh, when we went on this trip, C.E. and I and Lucian and Peggy, and this limousine, this driver, and Lucian would direct him, go here, go here. And after, 30 years, he'd say, oh, yeah, this is it. I remember this, and I remember this, and he remembered where to turn. His memory was really astounding. But
Long time ago.
Go Navy, beat Army.
If everybody will just head up either through the elevator or through the stairs up to the 3rd floor. There's a room called the Arizona Missouri Meeting Room. That's where your lunch will be served. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm supposed to put it on or not, but I can't.
Thank you very much. Oh, hey, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Like your story, best.
Wasn't that nice?
Running them kids.